spoken about the Bible having two testaments. Old Testament, New Testament, right? Now, the Old Testament, I've said, is basically the Jewish Bible. The New Testament is a collection of smaller writings that depict the life and teachings of Jesus and his followers, his early followers. Among these documents, the first four are called Gospels. So there are four Gospels. Each one, in its own way, is a sort of biography of Jesus, his seerah, telling us about where he was born, where he lived, where he preached, what he said, the kinds of works that he did, and eventually how he met his end and how he was taken up into heaven. Four Gospels. Now, when we look into the life of Jesus as told in these four Gospels, we see that Jesus himself was reading the Torah. For example, in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 4, Jesus goes into the synagogue and he opens up the scroll of Isaiah and he begins to preach. Now, what concept of God do we have in the book of Isaiah? Throughout, there is an emphasis on only one God. So the question is, how do we go from the one God that Jesus was preaching to now eventually the declaration of the Trinity? And to begin with, the declaration that Jesus is true God of true God. How do we get from Jesus to Nicaea? Well, we have four Gospels. And the four Gospels were not written all at once, nor were they written in the same area. They were written in different places and circulated separately on individual scrolls. Eventually, after about 100 years of Christianity, these documents are collected together into the one book that we can call the New Testament. Now, initially, when these documents were circulated in different areas, the readers of one did not know what was said in the other. Some of the authors knew the other writings because they were scholars. They gathered material, they studied, they knew what others were writing about Jesus, and they wrote, sometimes copying from others. Today, it is widely held that two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, were both copied from a singular source, Mark, one of our four Gospels, and that John has a separate and independent tradition. So you have Mark, Matthew and Luke borrowing from Mark, and you have John separately. In terms of chronology, Mark obviously is the one that was written first. Scholars believe that was written around the year 70. And that Matthew and Luke around the year 85. And John approximately 100. Now if you line them up chronologically, so Jesus was here and he lived until about the year 30 when he was crucified. Then we're told by biblical scholars that Mark was written first around the year 70. And then Matthew and Luke around the year 85. And then John around the year 100. So John obviously was written then about 70 years after Jesus left the scene. Now what happened during that period of time? After Jesus had left? Naturally, people remembered some things about Jesus. People were preaching and teaching about Jesus. And you know how preachings go. If you don't have a written record, and it's just based on extemporaneous speech, then you would find it difficult to distinguish between what the person says that Jesus said and what he is adding as his own comments. You find that even today. With any document. Somebody quotes a passage, and then he starts to elaborate. Unless you knew the passage yourself already, you wouldn't be able to distinguish between what's the passage itself that he's quoting and what is his elaboration. In writing, you can see the difference because the quoted passage is in quotation marks and set off sometimes from the margin, sometimes in a different size of font and text, set off from the writer's own comments and explanation of that. But if somebody's delivering a speech orally, especially if he's doing it extemporaneously, he gets everything mixed in together. The quotation and his explanation. He quotes part, he explains some, he quotes another part, he explains some more, and you can't distinguish between which is the quoted part and which is the explanation. He himself forgets to make that distinction. So over the decades after Jesus had left the scene, the memorized material about him was in circulation in this way. being preached about. Jesus said this, and this is what he meant. And sometimes the saying and the meaning becomes one in a continuous whole. That is the kind of thing we can see happening in John's Gospel, the last of the four to be written, especially in John's Gospel. But it is to be noted in the others as well. In fact, when we look at the others, we can see that the image of Jesus actually grows from the way he appears in Mark's Gospel, the first of the four, to the way he finally appears in John's Gospel, the last of the four. You can see that Jesus becomes bigger and greater through the Gospels as we go from one to the other, from Mark to Matthew and Luke, and then finally to John's Gospel. Let me give you some examples of what actually can be noticed in these texts. The Gospels all show that Jesus was crucified. The first three Gospels show that he had some hesitation about this, and he prayed to God to save him from this. But eventually he submitted himself and he accepted what seemed to be his inevitable fate. So we have, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, that Jesus prays. In Matthew's Gospel, he falls on his face and he prays. And he prays, Father, save me from this hour. But in the Gospel according to John, he doesn't pray like that. In fact, on one occasion, he makes it explicit that he won't pray like that. He says, now my hour has come. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this very reason that I came to this hour. So, in the first three Gospels, on this score, he might appear very human. He can see the crucifixion coming, and he's asking God to save him from that. But he finally submits. Let your will be done, not mine. So he's finally submitted. But that initial hesitation is absent from the Gospel of John, the last of the four to be written. And not only absent, but denied. It won't be like that. He won't pray like that. Why? Because according to the Gospel of John, this is the plan that Jesus had with the Father from all eternity. So he came into the world to do precisely what he had planned from the beginning. And it will make no sense now for him to pray for something different. So it's a different conception in the Gospel according to John that we're noticing here. You can see a development from the early Gospels to this last of the four. If one were to compare even the first three Gospels by themselves and look at Mark and how Matthew and Luke have changed the story from the way it appeared in Mark, then you will see that Jesus again is growing before your very eyes. Remember that I said that you have Mark as the source for Matthew and Luke. Two Gospels borrowing from the Luke. So you can take a story, any episode in the life of Jesus, you can see the way it appears in Mark, and then you can see what Matthew has done with it and what Luke has done with it. Each have rewritten the story to get rid of what they might have thought are certain problems that they want to save their readers from. For example, there is a curious incident in which Jesus heals a blind man. But he does it in two attempts. After the first attempt, the man says, I can see people like trees moving. Means that his vision is still blurred. And then Jesus does it again, and then the man can see perfectly. So in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the story is given in such a way that there are no two attempts. Just one shot, the deed is done. In the Gospel according to Mark, you have an occasion where it explicitly says that Jesus could not do any mighty work in his hometown. And he was amazed at the disbelief of the people. He could not do any mighty work, according to the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, 1952 edition. Whereas in Matthew's version of the same story, Matthew has it that Jesus did not do many mighty works. So think about this carefully. Mark says Jesus could not do any mighty works and in his hometown. And Matthew says Jesus did not do many mighty works in his hometown. You see the difference? So there's a difference between could not and did not. There's a difference between did not do any and did not do